Captain America and the Avengers is a 1991 beat-em-up by Data East. The game was ported to the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. A version was brought to the NES, but that game is pretty forgettable and is not a beat-em-up. It's a side-scroller. So yeah, let's just move on. We're talking about the Super Nintendo version today. I really wish I had known about the arcade game, but yeah, it's fine. It would have probably been my favorite, or one of my favorites, but yeah, whatever. Let's get into the Super Nintendo version. This isn't as good as the Sega Genesis version of the game. The gameplay feels just a little bit off. I really wanted to like this one a lot more than I did, but unfortunately, yeah, the Super Nintendo version just makes me wish I was playing the Genesis version instead. This has the same plot as the arcade and the Genesis version. The Red Skull is trying to take over the world, and it's up to you to stop him. You'll be fighting a bunch of lesser-known villains along the way because they've been mind-controlled / reprogrammed and or convinced to fight alongside the Red Skull. I'm sure they would have done this anyway because the Red Skull is kind of a bigger deal and a lot of these guys are pretty small time. But hey, let's bring in mind control. Why not? I have in my notes here, apparently the Red Skull is using mind control, and I'm pretty sure they would have just helped him if he had just asked these other villains nicely. But he's the Red Skull, he's a Nazi, he's not going to help anybody, and he's not going to ask anyone nicely to do anything. But seriously, they probably would have just gone along with it. I mean, he probably could have reprogrammed Ultron. He definitely could have reprogrammed the Sentinel that's in this. But, yeah, whatever. They all hate Captain America and the others, so they probably would have helped him. The story does feel an awful lot like a comic book, which is kind of the point. It works great for a game like this, where you don't really need a story for this to really work, and yeah, it's pretty great for what it is. I did not like the gameplay very much for this. I think the Genesis version is a lot more solid than the Super Nintendo version. In the Super Nintendo version, hitting the enemies can just be a frustrating experience, and there seems to be a death zone or something right in front of every enemy, so if you happen to wander directly in front of them, you know, like when you're trying to punch them, you just get the crap kicked out of you. It felt unfair at times, like you're getting just beat up by two enemies, there's no rhyme or reason to it, and you're really reliant on your jumping attacks to get you out of a lot of the situations you find yourself in. This becomes a huge problem when you run into the boss fights, where it's just not fair at times, or at least it didn't feel fair. Much like the arcade and the Genesis version, you've got 4 playable characters. It's Captain America, Vision, Iron Man, and Hawkeye. Other characters or other Avengers do appear throughout the game, which again made me wonder why the hell they aren't helping you. I mean, anyone's better than Hawkeye, so why couldn't Wonder Man take his place? But I guess they wanted some of the more, recognizable Avengers in it, and not Wonder Man. I don't know. These characters I'm not overly familiar with, so if these are the most popular ones, please let me know. I know they appeared in the movies, but aside from that, I'm not too familiar with, how popular they are in the comics. So the game has a ton of mini-bosses in it, which is pretty awesome. As somebody who did not read a lot of comic books growing up, I didn't know who any of these people were. So playing a lot of these beat-em-ups was how I learned about different comic book characters, different comic book villains, and in theory it could have gotten me more into comic books if there had been a store that really sold them around me. I was kind of limited to, going to the grocery store and occasionally seeing one and then maybe having the money to get it. So, yeah, very limited on what comic books I could actually get. Anyway, the list of villains is Ulysses Claw, the Living Laser, Whirlwind, Sentinel, Grim Reaper, Wizard, Mecha Octo, the Mandarin, Juggernaut, Ultron, and then you've got two versions of the Red Skull, and you also have Crossbones as well. It's a pretty good list. Now that I actually know who many of these characters are, it's a pretty solid list of villains, and it's really awesome that they're all in here. The bosses can actually be pretty cheap. I could say this about all of the enemies in the game that you're going to be encountering, but with the bosses it seems even more annoying. There are also issues with the gameplay when it just comes to a lot just from trying to hit them. Like, just the simple act of walking up and punching one of these people, which should be fairly simple in a beat-em-up, somehow it just becomes this huge chore to actually dodge the opponent's projectiles, hit them in the face, and yeah, it's a really frustrating game. Especially when you're fighting two bosses at the same time, and when you think you're lined up to avoid their attacks, but they hit you anyway. It can be incredibly frustrating, especially since your hit detection has to be just spot on, and theirs seems like, nah, they can hit you from anywhere. It's very, very annoying. The shoot-'em-up stages are still here, and I like those a lot just because they break up some of the monotony and the repetitive nature of a beat-em-up. You don't have to worry about doing the same thing over and over again, and also just going through this repetitive, annoying attacks scheme that they have set up where you have a huge hitbox and you have to deal with a bunch of bullshit. I like that an awful lot. There are 4 levels, which is what you should expect from a beat-em-up like this. It isn't too long. None of the beat-em-ups from the early 90s really were, so you can probably knock this game out in a little under an hour if you don't really know what you're doing. If you know what you're doing, you can probably do it in like 45 minutes, half an hour to 45 minutes, something like that. The levels don't feel as long as the Genesis version for some reason. Maybe I'm wrong, but it just sort of felt like these were a little shorter than the Genesis version for whatever reason. The same power-up system is in the game where you have to collect life discs to basically give yourself more life. And then you can also get little companions, like the Wasp will show up and do some fun stuff for you. And yeah, that's kind of it for a game like this. It's pretty simple. It's not the worst game that I've ever played, and it's definitely not the worst beat-em-up on the Super Nintendo. But I don't like it as much as I like the Genesis version. This is one of the games where I think the Genesis version looks better. The Genesis port seems to be more detailed than the Super Nintendo one, and the Super Nintendo looks good, but there's just something that it's missing from the Genesis port. The visuals kind of hurt this game, because it's hard to line up your attacks. This one is just way more annoying in certain parts of the game, like when you're trying to punch enemies and you end up punching through them instead of hitting them in the face like you want. The cutscenes look great. I like the comic book approach to it. That's just wonderful. It feels like it could have been the plot to one of the different series, but I don't know if it was or not. Maybe it could have been. However, Marvel would have probably messed it up. Just because that's kind of what comic book companies do at times. I do like how the game looks, but I still prefer the Sega Genesis version, and I would probably rather go back and play the arcade as well. I think this version is fine. It has decent gameplay and decent graphics, and it can be fun, especially once you figure out how to actually play it and get over the fact that the hitboxes are kind of messed up at times. The visuals do hurt the gameplay. The boss fights can be a little cheap, and a lot of just the random encounters with enemies can be pretty cheap. But the more you play it, the more you'll be able to adapt to it. I do like the Genesis version more than this one. The Super Nintendo version, it just doesn't look as good as the Genesis version, and I don't think the gameplay is as good as the Genesis version either. There is something about this version that just feels off to me. I really wanted to like this game more because I like the Genesis version of it. Unfortunately, this isn't the one that I would recommend people play. I would go for the arcade, or again, go for the Sega Genesis version, or Mega Drive if you want to try that one instead. I do like these Marvel beat-em-ups a lot. The Captain America and the Avengers is a pretty interesting one, and it's one that I just didn't know that it existed before trying the console versions. And it makes me kind of want to go and play the arcade and see how well that one holds up. It'll probably be exactly the same, though. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.